Kevin owned a quiet little antique shop right in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon. His shop sat right at the base of the historic Burnside Bridge, which many locals consider to be the gateway to the city. Because Kevin made his living selling relics from the past, he was constantly on the move. He spent his weekends traveling to yard sales, flea markets, and estate auctions, always searching for the next unique item he could feature in his store. One afternoon, he heard about an estate sale happening at the home of a woman who had recently passed away at the age of 103. She was a Holocaust survivor who had lived a remarkably long and complicated life, and now her family was selling off all her worldly possessions. Kevin decided to go and check it out. When he arrived at the house, he noticed that the organizers of the estate sale were not selling things individually. Instead, they had grouped everything into different lots, bundling similar items together so that buyers had to bid on an entire package. Kevin walked through the rooms, looking at the various lots, until his eyes landed on one labeled Lot 29. This particular lot caught his attention because it contained several vintage tools that he knew would sell quickly in his shop. But right in the middle of those tools was a strange, weathered wooden box. It was simply labeled Mystery Box. Kevin was immediately intrigued by it. He liked a good mystery, and he figured the box alone was worth a small bid. He placed his offer, and by the end of the afternoon, he found out he had won the lot. He was thrilled. He gathered up his new items, loaded them onto a small cart, and wheeled them out to the driveway where his car was parked. As he was lifting the heavy wooden box into his trunk, he heard a voice behind him. He turned around and saw a woman, one of the late homeowner's granddaughters, looking at him with a serious expression. She asked him if he was the one who just bought the Dybbuk box. When the woman said those words, Kevin felt a chill go down his spine. The term Dybbuk immediately took him back to his childhood. Growing up in a Jewish household, Kevin had been raised on stories of folklore and history. In Jewish mythology, a Dybbuk is a highly malevolent, restless spirit that is said to wander the earth seeking a human host to possess. When Kevin was a little boy, his parents would often tease him when he was misbehaving, telling him that if he did not clean his room or listen to his teachers, the Dybbuk would come and get him. Over time, that playful threat had turned into a very real, deep-seated childhood fear. Hearing this random stranger call his new purchase a Dybbuk box instantly brought all those old fears rushing back to the surface. Kevin looked at the woman and asked her if she had really just called it a Dybbuk box. The woman nodded and told him that was exactly what her grandmother had always called it. She explained that her grandmother was absolutely terrified of the box and had made her family promise that they would never, under any circumstances, open it. Kevin looked down at the wooden chest in his hands. It was about 2 feet tall and 1 foot wide, made of dark, heavy wood. On the front, there were 2 small doors that swung outward, and at the very bottom, there was a single wooden drawer. A metal latch sat across the 2 doors, and it was held shut by a relatively modern padlock. Kevin asked the woman why her grandmother had been so afraid of it and what was actually inside. The woman shook her head and said they never knew what was in it because they were too afraid to ask. She told him that every single time someone in the house even whispered the word Dybbuk, her grandmother would spit on the floor to ward off evil and refuse to speak for hours. It was so incredibly weird that the family just learned to stay away from the box and never question her. Kevin agreed that it was a very strange story, but he finished loading his trunk, closed it, said goodbye to the woman, and got into his driver's seat. As he drove back to his shop, he laughed off the interaction. He figured it was just an old family legend, a piece of harmless superstition from a centenarian who had survived a terrible war. At this point, he did not believe the box was actually dangerous or haunted. To him, it was just a cool, slightly creepy conversation piece that he could showcase in his antique store. When Kevin arrived back at his Portland shop, he began unloading his trunk. He carried the tools and the mysterious wooden box inside. The main floor of his shop was where he displayed his best inventory for customers, but he had a much larger basement warehouse downstairs. This basement was a massive room filled with rows of tall industrial metal shelving, cluttered with decades of collected antiques, furniture, and inventory. It also had a large wooden workbench in the back where Kevin would clean, repair, and price new items before bringing them up to the showroom. Kevin carried the Dybbuk box down the wooden basement steps and set it on the workbench. He turned to walk back upstairs, but as he reached the bottom of the steps, his curiosity got the better of him. He could not stop thinking about what might be inside the locked chest. He walked back to the workbench and looked closely at the padlock. It looked fairly new, and the metal was thick enough that he could not just pull it open or break it with his bare hands. He did not have the key, and he did not have bolt cutters nearby. He grabbed a flathead screwdriver from his tool rack, wedged a metal tip underneath the brass hinges that held the lock mechanism to the wood, and slowly began to pry. With a loud pop, the metal screws gave way, pulling out of the ancient wood. The lock fell to the table. As soon as Kevin pulled the latch back and swung the 2 front doors open, a faint clicking sound echoed through the quiet basement. A hidden mechanical linkage inside the box activated, and the bottom drawer smoothly slid open all by itself. Kevin stared at it, momentarily impressed. He thought it was a remarkably clever piece of craftsmanship for such an old, simple-looking wooden cabinet, but when he looked at what was actually inside the compartments, he was a bit disappointed. Resting in the velvet-lined drawer and the main cabinet were a few strange, seemingly random items. There were 2 copper wheat pennies from the 1920s, a small, half-burned wax candle, a tiny granite monument slab with the Hebrew word shalom carved into it, a small silver wine goblet, and 2 locks of hair tied with pieces of string. Kevin picked up the items and examined them. To him, they did not look like objects of black magic or demonic portals. They just looked like the sentimental keepsakes of an elderly woman who wanted to preserve a few memories from her youth. He figured the hair probably belonged to her children or late husband, and the pennies were likely from a year that held personal significance to her. Feeling like the mystery had been solved and was ultimately pretty mundane, Kevin put the items back, closed the wooden doors, pushed the box to the corner of his workbench, and went back upstairs to finish his workday. The next morning, Kevin had to leave the shop to run several errands across town. He left his sole employee, a young woman named Jane, in charge of the store. Jane was an incredibly talented saleswoman, and Kevin trusted her implicitly to manage the business while he was away. Shortly after Kevin left, Jane locked the front glass door of the shop. The store was not officially open for business yet, and she wanted to head down to the basement warehouse to grab a few specific items to bring up to the main display floor before the first customers arrived. She was completely alone in the building. She opened the heavy metal security door at the top of the stairs, walked down the creaking wooden steps, and entered the vast, dim basement. The lighting in the basement was notoriously poor. Kevin and Jane used long fluorescent tube bulbs that hung from the high concrete ceiling, but over the years, many of them had burned out. Because the metal shelves were so tall and packed with fragile antiques, replacing the bulbs was a massive chore. You had to drag a heavy ladder down the narrow aisles, balance it precariously, and reach over delicate glassware to swap the tubes. Because of this, Kevin and Jane usually waited until almost all the lights were dead before they bothered to change them. On this particular morning, only 2 or 3 bulbs were still working, casting a weak, flickering yellow glow over the massive room, leaving the far corners of the basement in total darkness. Jane walked past the workbench where the Dybbuk box sat and made her way to the far back corner of the warehouse to search the shelves. As she was reaching up to grab a vintage item, she suddenly froze. A wave of intense anxiety washed over her. She felt an overwhelming sensation that she was not alone. It was the distinct, unmistakable feeling of someone standing right behind her, watching her every move. Jane had spent countless hours in this basement by herself in both the light and the dark, and she had never felt anything like this before. She knew the front door of the shop was locked. She had not heard the metal security door at the top of the stairs open, and there was absolutely no other entrance or exit to the basement. There was no physical way anyone else could be down there with her. She tried to tell herself she was just letting the dark, creepy atmosphere get to her. Suddenly, the loud, shrill ring of the landline telephone at the base of the stairs shattered the silence. The sudden noise made Jane jump, but it also snapped her out of her panic. She took a deep breath, laughed at her own nervousness, and walked over to the desk to answer it. It was her friend, who was calling to chat about their plans for later that day. As Jane was standing by the desk talking to her friend on the phone, she heard a strange sound coming from the dark aisles behind her. It was a dry, wooden clatter, exactly like the sound of a wooden broom handle slipping against a wall and falling onto a concrete floor. The sound startled her again. She told her friend on the line that she had to call them back, hung up the phone, and stood in the dim light, listening intently. The basement was dead silent. Because the light was so poor, she could not see down the far aisles where the sound had originated. She swallowed her fear, took a slow step forward, and began walking down one of the narrow corridors between the metal shelves to see what had fallen. She had only taken a few steps when she heard a massive explosion of breaking glass directly behind her. She spun around and saw that one of the long fluorescent light tubes had somehow detached from the ceiling fixture and shattered into thousands of tiny pieces on the concrete floor. Jane was terrified. She did not want to look for any fallen brooms anymore. She just wanted to get out of the dark basement. She turned back toward the stairs and began to jog. But as she rounded the corner of one of the heavy shelves, a heavy wooden chair that had been sitting securely on a middle shelf suddenly flew off the rack and slammed hard onto the concrete floor, landing directly in the middle of the aisle. Blocking her path, Jane screamed at the top of her lungs. There was absolutely no way that heavy chair could have fallen on its own. It had been pushed with incredible force. In her mind, there was a real intruder in the dark with her. She leapt over the wooden chair, ran as fast as she could to the wooden stairs, and scrambled up the steps. She reached the top and grabbed the metal security door to fling it open, but it would not budge. The heavy door was completely shut and locked. The security door was designed to lock from the outside with a physical key to prevent burglars from getting from the basement into the main store, or vice versa. Jane knew she had not locked it when she came down, and she was the only person in the building. Panic completely took over. She grabbed the metal bars of the gate and began shaking them violently, screaming Kevin's name, hoping he had somehow returned early and locked the door by mistake. But there was no answer. From the darkness of the basement below her, the sound of shattering glass erupted again as another fluorescent bulb exploded. Then another. Jane was trapped in the dark with something she could not see, and she believed she was about to be attacked. She pulled out her cell phone with trembling hands and dialed Kevin's number. Meanwhile, Kevin was driving back to his shop. He was only a block or two away when he saw his phone ringing on the passenger seat. He picked it up and answered, and immediately, Jane's hysterical, screaming voice filled the car. She was sobbing, shouting that someone was in the shop, that things were being thrown and broken. Through the speaker, Kevin could hear the distinct, terrifying sounds of glass shattering and heavy objects smashing against the ground. He tried to calm her down, asking her where she was and what was happening. Jane screamed that she was trapped in the basement and that someone was down there with her. Kevin told her to call the police immediately and get out, but before she could answer, the call suddenly disconnected. Kevin slammed on his brakes, pulled a sharp turn, and floored the gas toward his shop. He parked haphazardly on the curb, his heart pounding in his chest. He did not know if he was walking into an active armed robbery, a hostage situation, or if Jane was being hurt. He ran to the front door, unlocked it with his keys, and rushed inside. The main floor of the shop was completely silent. Everything was in its perfect, undisturbed place. He yelled Jane's name, but there was no response. He walked quickly to the back of the store toward the basement door. When he reached the heavy metal gate, he was shocked to find it was locked shut. Kevin knew he was the only one who carried the key to that lock, and he had not locked it. He unlocked the gate, swung it open, and began to cautiously descend the dark wooden stairs. He reached for the light switch at the bottom and flipped it, but none of the lights came on. The basement was pitch black, save for the faint light coming from the open door at the top of the stairs. As he rounded the corner, he saw Jane. She was sitting stiffly in a wooden chair next to the desk where the telephone sat. Her face was completely pale, and she was staring blankly into the darkness, showing absolutely no emotion. She was in a state of deep shock. Kevin looked past her and was horrified by the state of his basement. Heavy wooden furniture had been pulled off the high shelves and lay smashed on the floor. Glass from the broken light bulbs was scattered everywhere, glittering in the dim light. He turned back to Jane and asked her what had happened. Jane, speaking in a low, flat voice, said she did not know. She explained that she had felt a presence, and then things just started flying off the shelves and the ceiling, shattering around her. Kevin's adrenaline was pumping, and his mind was racing. He took a flashlight and walked through the dark aisles of the basement, searching every corner, behind every shelf, and under every table. He was looking for an intruder, but the basement was completely empty. There was no one there, and there was no physical way anyone could have escaped. Kevin walked back to the stairs. He looked at the locked gate, the broken furniture, and then he looked at Jane. In his mind, the only logical explanation was that Jane had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and had destroyed the basement herself. He asked her, point blank, if she was the one who did this. When he said those words, Jane's shock instantly turned into white-hot rage. She stood up, looked Kevin dead in the eye, told him to go to hell, and walked up the stairs. She walked out of the shop and never returned, quitting her job on the spot. At the time, Kevin felt bad about how things ended, but he truly believed Jane had done it. He still did not connect the incident to the Dybbuk box sitting on the workbench in the back of the room. A few days later, Kevin's mother was scheduled to visit the shop. It was her birthday, and Kevin had made plans to take her out to a nice lunch to celebrate. When she walked into the antique store, Kevin smiled and told her he had a special birthday present for her. He led her over to a table where a beautifully wrapped box was sitting. He placed it in front of her and began to unwrap the paper, revealing the dark wooden Dybbuk box. Before he could explain what it was or the strange story behind it, the phone at the other end of the store began to ring. Kevin was expecting an important business call, so he told his mother to hang on for just a second, and he ran to the back of the shop to answer it. While Kevin was occupied on the phone, his mother sat alone at the table. Curiously, she reached out and pulled the two wooden doors of the box open. The moment the doors swung open, an overwhelming, suffocating sense of dread and cold air rushed out of the box. Kevin's mother gasped, suddenly feeling a massive pressure in her chest and head. She tried to cry out, but she couldn't. She suffered a massive, debilitating stroke right there in the chair. Her body went completely rigid, and she collapsed sideways, unable to move or speak. From the back of the store, Kevin heard a strange, heavy thud. He hung up the phone and ran back to the front showroom. He was horrified to find his mother slumped over, her face partially paralyzed, gasping for air. He ran to her, screaming for help, and immediately dialed 911. While they waited for the paramedics to arrive, Kevin's mother lay on the floor, completely conscious but trapped inside her own paralyzed body. She would later write on a piece of paper that during those terrifying minutes, she felt an absolute certainty that the wooden box on the table had caused her stroke. She tried desperately to communicate this to Kevin. Since she could not speak or move her limbs, she began flicking her eyes wildly back and forth. She would look directly at the open Dybbuk box, then look at Kevin, then back to the box, over and over again, praying that her son would understand her silent warning. Kevin noticed her eyes moving, but in the panic of the moment, he assumed she was just disoriented from the stroke. It was not until hours later, after she had been stabilized at the hospital, that he sat down and really thought about her terrified expression and the way she had been staring at that box. Kevin began to realize that something was deeply, terribly wrong with the Dybbuk box. He did not know if it was a curse, a string of highly improbable bad luck, or if there was actual truth to the legend of the Dybbuk, but he knew he did not want it in his shop or his life any longer. Every major disaster in his life had occurred since the moment he brought that box into his store. He decided to put it up for sale immediately. He placed it on a display table near the front entrance of his shop, hoping someone would buy it and take the bad luck with them. Within a couple of days, a young, smiling couple came into the store. They saw the unique wooden cabinet, thought it was beautiful, and bought it. Kevin felt a massive wave of relief as they walked out the door with it. He believed the nightmare was finally over. But just 2 days later, Kevin was working in the back of his shop when he heard the front door open and close. He walked out to greet the customer, but the showroom was completely empty. Instead, sitting right in the middle of the floor was the Dybbuk box. The young couple had driven back, opened the door, set the box down, and left without saying a single word. Kevin walked over to it and saw a small piece of lined paper taped to the top of the dark wood. Written on the paper in hurried, messy handwriting were the words, "This has an odd darkness about it." Kevin was deeply freaked out. The fact that other people who knew absolutely nothing about the box's history or what had happened to his mother and Jane had felt the exact same malevolent energy was terrifying. He knew he could not sell it again in good conscience, but he was also too afraid to simply throw it in the trash. He loaded the box into the trunk of his car, drove to his home, and placed it inside a secure storage locker in his backyard. He locked the door and tried to push it out of his mind. But that night, the terror followed him into his sleep. Kevin had a dream that was so vivid and realistic, it felt entirely real. In the dream, he was walking through a beautiful, sunlit stone courtyard, holding the hand of a woman who was a close and trusted friend. The atmosphere was incredibly warm and peaceful. But suddenly, the woman's grip on his hand tightened, and she began to pull away. Kevin tried to step forward, but his feet were completely glued to the stone floor. He was anchored to the spot. He watched as his friend was pulled backward, her hand slipping from his until she disappeared into a pitch-black corner of the courtyard. Kevin stood in the silence of the dream, unable to move, staring into the darkness. Suddenly, a figure began to slowly emerge from the black mist. It was an old, hunched-over woman. Her head was bowed, and she was walking with a slow, shuffling gait. As she got closer and closer to Kevin, the air in the dream grew freezing cold. When she was just a few feet away, she slowly raised her head. Kevin gasped in horror. The woman's face was completely rotting away. Heavy chunks of decayed skin were sloughing off her skull, revealing the wet, yellow bone underneath. She was a walking corpse. She raised her decayed hands, reached out, and grabbed Kevin's face. She began to violently tear and claw at his skin, ripping pieces of his face off. Kevin woke up screaming, thrifting himself upright in his bed, drenched in sweat. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He sat there for several minutes, trying to calm down, telling himself it was just a nightmare. He got out of bed and went into the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. As he looked into the mirror, he gasped. Covered across his shoulders, his collarbone, and his upper arms were dark, deep purple bruises that looked exactly like the finger marks of someone who had gripped him with immense force. He tried to tell himself it was a coincidence, that he must have bruised himself working in the shop, but he knew the truth. The bruises were fresh, and they perfectly matched the attack in his dream. The next night, Kevin fell asleep and had the exact same dream. The beautiful courtyard, the friends slipping away, the rotting old woman, and the horrific clawing at his face. When he woke up, he ran to the bathroom. His entire back, chest, and neck were now covered in deep, painful bruises and red scratches. Kevin was terrified. He realized the Dybbuk box was slowly killing him, even from inside the locked storage locker in his yard. He went straight to his computer, logged onto eBay, and listed the box for sale. He wrote an incredibly detailed, honest description of the box, detailing every single strange and terrible thing that had happened to him, his mother, Jane, and the young couple since he had purchased it. He made it clear that he believed the box was haunted by a malicious spirit. 2 college students named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, were browsing eBay late that night. They were fascinated by the paranormal and regularly searched the internet for items that were claimed to be haunted or cursed. They wanted to test these items to see if ghosts and demons were actually real. When they stumbled upon Kevin's listing, they thought it was the ultimate find. They did not believe the stories were real, but they loved the creepy aesthetic and thought it would make a great talking point for their friends. They purchased the box, and Kevin shipped it out the very next day, glad to finally be rid of it. 3 weeks later, the package arrived at the boys' apartment in Missouri. Brian was in class, but Sam was home to receive it. He eagerly tore open the cardboard box, pulled out the dark wooden cabinet, and set it on the kitchen table. A few hours later, Brian walked through the front door of the apartment. As soon as he stepped inside, he was hit with a suffocating, putrid smell. It smelled like someone had poured buckets of stagnant old urine all over the carpets. He covered his nose and walked through the apartment, trying to find the source of the terrible odor. The smell grew stronger as he approached the kitchen. When he walked inside, he saw Sam standing proudly next to the Dybbuk box on the table. Brian asked Sam if he smelled the horrific odor, and Sam just laughed, joking that it was the smell of the ancient dead. Sam was so amused by the box that he joked about sleeping with it in his bed. He set up an online blog to document their experience with the box, planning to post daily updates about whether any paranormal activity occurred. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened. The box sat on their counter, and the boys treated it like a joke. They threw massive college parties, and they would bring the box out to the middle of the room. People would drink beer around it, open the doors, stuff trash inside, and make fun of the alleged curse. But as soon as they began disrespecting the box, their lives began to fall apart. It started with their electronics. Sam was sitting at his desk when his laptop suddenly shut off and refused to turn back on. When he took it to a repair shop, the technician told him the hard drive had been completely fried and was utterly unrecoverable. Then, both Sam and Brian noticed that their wristwatches would completely stop working the moment they crossed the threshold into their apartment. They would change the batteries, set the time, but the hands would remain frozen until they walked outside. Their Xbox console refused to power on inside the apartment, but when they carried it over to a friend's house, it worked perfectly. Even their simple kitchen toaster began malfunctioning, instantly incinerating any piece of bread they put inside, turning it to black ash within seconds. Initially, the boys did not connect these issues to the box. They just thought they were having a run of bad electronic luck. But then, the activity escalated. In the middle of the night, the light bulbs in their apartment began to explode. They would be asleep and would suddenly be awakened by the loud pop of shattering glass. They would replace the bulbs, only for them to burst again a few hours later. Eventually, they ran out of bulbs and could not afford to keep buying them, leaving their apartment in near-total darkness. Then came the insects. One afternoon, Brian walked into the kitchen and saw a massive swarm of bugs crawling out from behind the refrigerator, out of the drains, and out of the cracks in the walls. Hundreds of roaches, spiders, and flies were crawling across the floor, but they were not spreading out. They were all marching in a direct line toward the Dybbuk box. The wooden chest was completely covered in a writhing black mass of insects. The boys tried to spray them, but the bugs kept coming, crawling inside the open doors of the cabinet. The infestation got so bad that they had to seal the kitchen door shut and avoid the room entirely. Despite the terror, Sam's blog was gaining massive traction on campus and online. The boys liked the attention and the clout they were getting from their classmates, so they refused to get rid of the box. But then, Sam's health began to rapidly deteriorate. Within a matter of weeks, his thick hair began to fall out in massive clumps, leaving him partially bald. He began to suffer from severe, non-stop hallucinations. No matter where he was, whether he was in class, at the library, or in his room, he could see the silhouette of a hunched-over old woman wrapped in a dark shawl standing in his peripheral vision. Every time he turned his head to look directly at her, she would disappear, only to reappear on the other side. The constant, terrifying presence drove him to insomnia. He was too afraid to sleep. He began dragging his mattress into Brian's room, sleeping on the floor next to his friend's bed just to feel some sense of safety. But even there, he would lie awake all night, watching the dark, shadowed figure of the old woman stand in the corner of the room. Watching him, the terror eventually became too much to bear. The boys realized the curse was very real, and it was destroying their lives. They took the Dybbuk box, put it back on eBay, and sold it to a man named Jason, who was a university museum director in Missouri. Jason had been following Sam's blog with great interest. As a museum curator and historian, he was fascinated by historical oddities and folklore, and he wanted to examine the box in a controlled professional environment. He purchased the box, and the boys shipped it off immediately, relieved to finally have their apartment back. The package arrived at Jason's office in the middle of a busy workday. He did not want to open it around his staff, so he locked the box in the back of his truck and waited until the evening. Once the museum had closed and everyone had gone home, Jason brought the heavy package up to his private office, set it on his desk, and cut open the cardboard. Jason decided to treat the Dybbuk box with the same scientific care he would use for any ancient artifact. He took out his camera and took high-resolution photographs of every angle of the wooden chest. He then turned off the office lights and scanned the dark wood with a powerful blacklight. He was shocked to find trace residues of wax splattered all over the top and sides of the box, arranged in distinct patterns. This suggested to him that the box had indeed been used in some sort of elaborate ritualistic ceremonies in the past. Jason took a deep breath, sat down at his desk, and pried open the metal doors. The bottom drawer slid open with a metallic click. Jason held his breath, expecting something terrifying to happen immediately, but nothing did. The room remained quiet. He looked at the pennies, the candle, the locks of hair, and the silver cup. He felt a sudden wave of disappointment. He figured the college kids had just fabricated the entire story for internet fame and that the box was just a harmless, creepy antique. He closed the doors, set the box on a side table in his office, and went home. The next morning, Jason's colleagues arrived at the office. He showed them the box and shared the legend of the Dybbuk, explaining how it was supposed to cause strokes, hallucinations, and electronic failures. His coworkers laughed, thinking it was a fun story. But within 48 hours, the atmosphere in the office completely changed. First, the office computers began to crash. The screens would freeze, the hard drives would fail, and the university's IT department was completely baffled, unable to recover any of the lost data. Then, the office light bulbs began to pop and shatter, one by one. The staff had to keep a massive box of replacement bulbs on hand, swapping them out multiple times a day. Finally, every single one of Jason's coworkers who shared the office space with the box became violently ill. They suffered from extreme fatigue, splitting headaches, and nausea. They finally walked into Jason's office and demanded that he get the box out of the building. They did not care if he believed in ghosts or not. They wanted the box gone. Jason did not want to cause trouble at work, so he took the Dybbuk box, wrapped it in a heavy blanket, and locked it in the trunk of his truck. He drove home, but he did not want to bring the box inside his house where his wife and young son were. He figured keeping it in the covered bed of his truck in the driveway was safe enough. He went inside, had dinner with his family, and went to bed. To understand what happened to Jason that night, you have to understand the layout of his house. When you walk through the front door, there is a wall on your right. You walk forward a few feet, and on your left is a carpeted staircase leading to the second floor. At the top of the stairs, directly ahead, is a bathroom. If you turn left and walk down a short hallway, you enter the master bedroom. In the master bedroom, on the left wall, there is a large bay window that looks out onto the street. Right outside that window is a bright orange street light. Even with the shades drawn, a heavy, eerie orange glow completely fills the bedroom at night. The bed is positioned with the foot pointing toward the window and the headboard resting against the back wall. Jason slept on the left side of the bed, closest to the window, and his wife slept on the right. That night, Jason fell into a deep sleep. But a few hours later, he woke up suddenly. He was lying flat on his back, staring at the ceiling. He tried to turn his head, but he couldn't. He tried to lift his hands, but they felt like they were made of lead. He was experiencing severe sleep paralysis. The room was bathed in that thick, unnatural orange light from the window. Suddenly, Jason heard a sound that made his blood run cold. From the first floor, he heard the distinct, heavy sound of footsteps on the carpeted stairs. Slow, plodding, heavy steps, coming up one by one. Jason's eyes darted toward the open bedroom door. He could see the second floor landing in the orange light. He watched in absolute terror as a dark silhouette slowly stepped into the hallway. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see it was an old woman. She was wearing a heavy, dark shawl over her head, and her face was cast in shadow. The figure was solid and real. It was not a shadow or a trick of the light. She began to slowly shuffle into the bedroom, walking along the wall. She reached the foot of the bed and stopped. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at Jason. Suddenly, she lunged forward, moving with terrifying, supernatural speed. She ran around the side of the bed, loomed over Jason, and drove her long, clawed fingers directly into his eyes. Jason felt a wave of blinding, agonizing pain. He screamed at the top of his lungs and suddenly snapped out of the paralysis. His wife was shaking him, yelling his name, trying to wake him up from what she thought was just a terrible nightmare. Jason sat up, panting, clutching his face. His eyes were burning and watering. He tried to tell himself it was just a dream, but the pain was incredibly real. The next morning, he went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. He gasped in horror. The whites of his eyes were completely ruptured, filled with bright red blood. He looked like he had been severely beaten or had his eyes gouged. Jason knew then that the Dybbuk box was actively targeting him. He wanted to throw it away, but he was terrified that if he did, someone else would find it and suffer the same fate. He decided to leave it in his truck while he researched how to properly destroy it. That evening, Jason was sitting in the living room watching television with his young son. The house was quiet. Suddenly, his son tapped him on the shoulder and pointed toward the kitchen. He asked his dad who that lady was standing in the doorway. Jason turned around and felt his heart stop. Standing right there in the dim kitchen light was the exact same old woman with the dark shawl from his nightmare. A second later, she vanished into thin air. Jason looked at his son, who was trembling, and realized they had both seen the exact same entity. Jason jumped up, grabbed his son, and screamed for his wife. He told them they had to leave the house immediately. They got into his wife's car and drove away, with Jason explaining the entire terrifying truth of the Dybbuk box to his wife as they drove. They decided to store the box in the basement of an empty rental property they owned a few miles away, locking it behind a heavy door until they could find a solution. That night, Jason found Kevin's contact information from the eBay transaction and called him. Kevin answered, and the two men, united by their shared terror, spoke for hours. Kevin offered to help. He decided to drive back to the house where he had purchased the box at the estate sale to see if he could find any living relatives of the Holocaust survivor who could tell him what the box actually was. The next day, Kevin knocked on the door of the Portland home. A middle-aged woman named Sophie answered. When Kevin introduced himself and mentioned the wooden box from Lot 29, Sophie's face fell. She sighed and told him she had begged her family not to sell that box. She told Kevin she knew what was inside and she had prayed no one would ever open it. Sophie explained that before World War II, she and her cousin Havla, the woman who had recently passed away at 103, lived in Poland. At the time, seances and spiritualism were massive trends among young people. Sophie, Havla, and their mother used to gather around a table for fun, trying to contact spirits. Havla had hand-stitched letters onto a heavy blanket to use as a makeshift Ouija board, and they would hold a brass pendant on a chain, asking questions and watching it swing. For a long time, nothing happened. But one night, the chain went completely rigid. It began to swing violently from letter to letter, spelling out the same 3 words over and over again. Release me, release me, release me. The women were terrified. They realized they had accidentally contacted a Dybbuk, a powerful and malevolent spirit that was now trying to attach itself to one of them. Desperate to protect themselves, Havla and her mother performed an ancient ritual trapping the spirit inside a wooden wine cabinet they had in the house. They closed the doors, sealed it with wax, and locked it with a padlock. That wine cabinet was the Dybbuk box. Havla had kept it locked and sealed for over 80 years, carrying it with her across Europe and eventually to America, terrified of what would happen if the spirit were ever set free. Kevin told Sophie that it was too late. The box had been opened, and the spirit was now terrorizing a family in Missouri. Sophie told him there was only one way to stop it. They needed to contact a group of rabbis who were trained in Orthodox spiritual cleansing. Kevin passed this information to Jason. Together, they contacted a group of local rabbis who agreed to perform a binding ritual. They met at the rental property, burned holy incense, recited ancient prayers, and managed to bind the spirit back inside the wooden box. They sealed the doors with wax, locked the padlock, and hid the Dybbuk box in a highly secure, undisclosed location where it has remained since 2003. Both Kevin and Jason have reported that since the box was sealed, all paranormal activity has completely ceased. They have vowed never to reveal the location of the box, ensuring that no one will ever have the chance to open it again. On the warm evening of June 20th, 1965, 4 close high school friends packed up a car and set off on a road trip into the desert. They were heading to a remote, barren location about 90 miles northwest of the glittering lights of Las Vegas, Nevada. To an outsider, their destination looked like nothing more than an empty, dusty patch of wasteland in the middle of Death Valley. But these 4 boys knew exactly where they were going, and they had been planning this trip for months. They parked their car on a dirt turnoff, opened the trunk, and began unloading hundreds of pounds of professional, heavy underwater diving gear. The group consisted of 19-year-old Paul Gianchieri, his brother-in-law, 20-year-old David Rose, 19-year-old Bill Alter, and Bill's younger brother, 16-year-old Jack. The boys were experienced divers, but they were about to attempt a dive that was highly illegal and incredibly dangerous. They carried their heavy oxygen tanks, regulators, and wetsuits up a steep, dusty hill. As they reached the crest of the hill, they were met with a tall, heavy-duty chain-link security fence. Affixed to the fence were several large, bright red signs that read, "Danger! Keep out! No trespassing! Government property." The boys did not hesitate. They walked right up to the fence, found a section where the metal mesh had been pried open at the bottom, and slid themselves and their heavy gear underneath. On the other side of the fence was a steep, rocky, 30-foot slope that led down into a deep, jagged fissure in the earth. At the bottom of this deep trench was a narrow pool of dark, still water. This was the entrance to Devil's Hole, a massive, ancient underground cave system that is filled with geothermal water that remains at a constant 92 degrees Fahrenheit all year round. The boys scrambled down the loose rocks, carrying their gear to the water's edge. As they began to strap on their heavy tanks, 16-year-old Jack, the youngest of the group, looked down into the pitch-black water and felt a sudden wave of anxiety. He looked at his brother and his friends and told them he was having second thoughts. He did not want to go into the cave. The other 3 boys shrugged and told him it was fine. Jack volunteered to stay on the rocky ledge at the surface to act as their lookout and manage their gear, while Paul, David, and Bill finished strapping on their masks and flippers. The 3 older boys turned on their powerful underwater flashlights, put their regulators in their mouths, and slipped into the warm, dark water of Devil's Hole. They swam to the center of the narrow pool, gave each other the thumbs-up sign, and submerged, disappearing into the dark abyss. Their plan was to make a deep dive down to the cave's known floor, which sat at about 325 feet below the surface. For the next 2 hours, Jack sat alone in the quiet, hot desert night, watching the still surface of the water, waiting for his friends to return. Just after midnight, the water suddenly bubbled, and the heads of David and Bill broke the surface. They gasped for air, pulling their regulators out. Jack smiled, but his smile quickly vanished when he realized Paul was not with them. David and Bill scrambled onto the rocky ledge, looking frantic. They asked Jack if Paul had come up already. Jack shook his head and said he had not seen anyone since they went down. Bill and David looked at each other in sheer panic. They explained that on their way back up from the deep section of the cave, the water had become incredibly cloudy with kicked-up silt, and they had gotten separated from Paul in the pitch black. They had assumed he had simply swam ahead of them and was already at the surface. Realizing Paul was still trapped somewhere in the dark tunnels below, David and Bill knew they had to act immediately. Their oxygen tanks were running low, but they put their regulators back in their mouths, plunged back into the water, and descended into the darkness to search for their friend. Bill would later recount that, as they descended back into the cave, David was swimming with frantic, reckless speed. He was desperate to find his brother-in-law. Bill tried to keep up with him, but the water was dark and filled with swirling debris. He could only track David by the faint glow of his flashlight ahead. David kept pushing deeper and deeper into the narrow, claustrophobic tunnels. Bill watched as David's light grew smaller and smaller in the distance until it suddenly vanished around a sharp rock bend. Bill swam as fast as he could to the corner, but when he rounded it, David was gone. Bill was now alone in the pitch black, his own oxygen gauge ticking dangerously close to empty. Realizing that staying down any longer would mean his own death, Bill made the agonizing decision to turn around. He swam back to the surface, breaking the water where his younger brother Jack was waiting. The two brothers sat on the ledge in the dark, staring at the water, praying for David and Paul to emerge, but the water remained perfectly still. As the hours ticked by, they knew they had run out of time. Jack scrambled up the rocky slope, slid under the fence, and ran to find a phone to call the authorities. When the local police received the report of the missing divers inside Devil's Hole, they immediately realized the gravity of the situation. Diving in Devil's Hole was strictly outlawed for a reason. The cave system was notoriously complex, filled with dead-end tunnels, extreme depths, and zero visibility. They contacted a professional rescue diver named Jim Hoots, who was one of the few people in the country licensed to dive inside the cave for scientific research. Jim knew the layout of Devil's Hole better than anyone alive. He rushed to the scene, arriving just a few hours after the boys had disappeared. Jim and his experienced dive partner geared up and slipped into the warm water. Their initial hope was that Paul and David had gotten disoriented and managed to find their way into a section of the cave known as Brown's Room. Brown's Room was a massive, subterranean cavern located about 90 feet down, which contained a large pocket of breathable air above the water level. If the boys had lost their way or run out of oxygen, they might have swam up into this air pocket and were now waiting on the rocky banks inside the dry cavern. Jim and his partner descended 90 feet through the dark water. The tunnel was incredibly narrow, requiring them to wiggle their bodies and heavy tanks through tight rock squeezes. They reached the entrance to the chimney tunnel that led up into Brown's Room. They slowly climbed the vertical shaft, broke the surface of the pool inside the dark cavern, and shone their lights around the empty, silent rocks. There was no one there. Jim and his partner descended back into the deep water. They knew that if the boys were not in Brown's Room, they were likely dead, as their oxygen tanks would have been fully depleted by now. They decided to drop deeper into the main cavern to look for their bodies. They descended past 150 feet into a massive, wide-open chasm. The space was so vast that when they shone their powerful underwater lights, the beams could not reach the far walls, giving them the eerie sensation of floating in the middle of a dark, infinite outer space. As they descended toward a large, flat, rocky shelf known as the lower ledge, which sat at about 200 feet, Jim's flashlight caught a sudden glint of reflection in the dark. They swam down to the rocky shelf and approached the reflection. Lying on the flat stone was a single rubber dive fin. Right next to it was a glass dive mask. Jim picked up the items and examined them. There were no bodies nearby. They carried the mask and fin back to the surface and showed them to Jack and Bill, who confirmed that they did indeed belong to Paul and David. Jim told the search coordinators that the boys were definitely deceased and that they were now shifting from a rescue mission to a body recovery operation. He and his partner rested, swapped out their oxygen tanks, and prepared to dive all the way to the absolute bottom of the cave to find the bodies. They plunged back into the water, descended through the tight 90-foot squeeze, and entered the massive infinity chasm. They bypassed the lower ledge and dropped all the way down to 325 feet, reaching the flat, sandy floor of the cave. The water at this depth was crystal clear, and Jim's powerful lights allowed him to see for dozens of yards in every direction. They slowly swam across the sandy floor, scanning the ground for the bright colors of the boys' wetsuits or tanks, but the floor was completely empty. There were no bodies, no equipment, and no signs of life. Jim was completely baffled. It was physically impossible for two bodies to have vanished from the bottom of this closed cave system. As Jim was swimming near the back wall of the cave floor, he noticed something he had never seen on his previous scientific dives. There was a small, jagged hole in the rock floor, barely wide enough for a single diver with a tank to squeeze through. Jim swam over to the opening and hovered directly above it. As he did, he felt a powerful, terrifying force pull at his legs. A massive current of water was rushing down into the hole, acting like a giant drain at the bottom of a bathtub. The suction was so strong that it began to pull Jim's body downward. He quickly swam backward, using his fins to fight the current and pull himself to safety. Jim pulled out a heavily weighted survey line from his gear pack. This line was 932 feet long, marked with depth indicators. He held the reel and dropped the heavy weight directly into the center of the drain hole. He watched as the line reeled out, spinning faster and faster as the current pulled it down. The line went 50 feet, 100 feet, 500 feet. It kept going until the entire 932 feet of line had been deployed, and the weight had still not hit a bottom. The hole was an absolute bottomless abyss. Jim and his partner knew they could not go down there. The current was far too strong, and they would be sucked down to their deaths. They swam back to the surface and reported their findings. They explained that Paul and David had likely suffered from nitrogen narcosis, a condition caused by breathing compressed air at great depths that produces a state of euphoria and severe disorientation, similar to extreme alcohol intoxication. Under the influence of narcosis, the boys probably did not realize they were drifting near the drain hole. The powerful current had seized them, stripped off their mask and fin as they fought the suction, and pulled them down into the bottomless pit. To this day, the bodies of Paul and David have never been recovered. Scientists still do not know how deep the drain hole at the bottom of Devil's Hole actually goes. However, in 2012, a massive 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck the country of Mexico, more than 2,000 miles away from the Nevada desert. At the exact same time the earthquake hit, a bizarre mini-tsunami erupted inside Devil's Hole, with water sloshing wildly, rising and falling by several feet. This bizarre event confirmed a long-standing scientific theory. The bottomless drain at the bottom of Devil's Hole connects to a massive, ancient underground ocean network that spans across the entire North American continent, and possibly the world. Today, the entrance to Devil's Hole is locked behind massive steel gates and monitored by armed government guards, ensuring that no one will ever dare to dive into its deadly dark waters again. In the late autumn of 1978, a sweet 9-year-old girl named Kim was walking down her quiet neighborhood street in a small town. Her mother was in the middle of cooking a big family dinner and had realized she was out of pasta sauce, so she had sent Kim to the local corner store just a few blocks away to grab a jar. Kim was a responsible, polite young girl who loved helping her family, and she was happy to run the quick errand. On her walk back from the store, carrying the jar of sauce in a small brown paper bag, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She did not think much of it, assuming it was just a neighbor. But as the footsteps grew closer, they speeded up until a man stepped up directly beside her, matching her pace. Kim looked up and saw a clean-cut, average-looking middle-aged man who was smiling warmly at her. He introduced himself as Dr. Ramsey and told her he was a pediatrician who had recently moved to the neighborhood. He asked her if she knew what a pediatrician was. Kim instantly felt a deep, uncomfortable wave of anxiety. Even at 9 years old, she had an incredibly strong intuition, and something about this man's sudden approach and his overly friendly demeanor felt completely wrong. She did not answer his question. Instead, she lowered her head, gripped the paper bag tightly, and began to walk faster. But as she speeded up,